Focused on quality and convenience, there isn't much you won't find at Marie's Mini Mart. Home-style breads, sandwiches, plus a variety of artisan breads and delicious single-serve desserts available exclusively at our Crocker Drive location. Marie's Mini Mart, with 25 locations wherever you go, there we are.
Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today is a journalist and author. He worked for the CBC for many years, but prior to that he was a reporter with the Evening Telegram during his student days, and it's where he met the subject of his new biography, this biography. It's about the life and writings of the late, great Newfoundland satirist Ray Guy, and it's my pleasure to welcome my friend and former colleague, Ron Crocker, to the program. Hi, Ron.
I'm very happy to be here, Karl, and thanks for inviting me.
It's great to see you. So what was your goal in writing this book about Ray?
The book is a kind of a hybrid of memoir and biography. Ultimately, though, my goal was to make his writing, to make Ray's writing better known to newer and younger generations. You know a lot about Ray Guy's career yourself, and you know that he produced an extraordinary body of work. Some of it, still well remembered, his Evening Telegram years for sure. Much of it not well known even at the time, and not remembered at all now. So my objective basically was to create a testimonial to his work and to make it better known.
Now, Ray was born and grew up in rural Newfoundland. It was very different rural Newfoundland from what we know today. What can you tell us about his formative years?
Well, Ray was born in 1939. One aspect of his formative years, his very early years, was World War II. He didn't enlist, obviously, but he was aware of the war at a very early age, probably as early as 3 or 4, because there was a significant U.S. military presence in Arnold's Cove, where he grew up. There was a surveillance group working right around that area, come by chance, and across in Trinity Bay, for good reason, in fact. The German submarines patrolled the near waters, the coastal waters of Newfoundland in some numbers, and you know some of that history as well as I do. So he was aware of that. That's one aspect of his childhood. Another is that, his parents, and I think a lot of other people in his parents' peer group, were anti-Confederates. And I think at a very young age, in the 1940s, by the mid-40s, when he was, aware of events and talk and chatter around him, I think he picked up a touch of that. He didn't become an anti-Confederate or anti-Canadian in his career, but he absorbed some of that. And what he really absorbed was the culture and values of 1940s, 1950s outport Newfoundland. Essentially an oral culture, a storytelling culture, a culture steeped in humor. It has its stresses, but in fact, it was a very enriching and encouraging culture that he grew up in, and his parents were enriching and encouraging parents.
He had a sister, Iris, and they were very close, weren't they? Can you talk about that brother-sister bond that they had?
Yeah, a year and a half, or about just under 2 years, I think, in the difference in age. Ray was older. But the bonded, I think, with common interests. Ray was a very active child, and Iris seemed to be a kind of, not quite a disciple, but almost a full supporter of his. I've seen no evidence whatever of any acrimony between them anywhere. Iris, of course, is still with us and talks, readily about Ray and their childhood. They got along extremely well. Ray took a lot of initiatives. In fact, in some ways, he seemed to be more active as a school child in terms of biting new things off than he was later. But Iris, for example, says that whenever there was a concert in the school or there was any need for concert or materials being written, Ray would do it all. If there was a skit on the stage, Ray would direct it. Iris, I think, was always his assistant and was perfectly happy in that role. Another, I think, rather sad dimension about their childhood that they were both aware of, and I think it somehow helped them bond, was the fact that there were two other children of his parents born, brought to term and born, but died in infancy. And they were aware of that as they grew up, and in fact it had quite a profound impact on Ray himself, although they weren't aware of it until they were of an age when it could have an impact and they could be aware of the significance and consequences of those kinds of events in those times. And of course, you know, childbirth and early childhood death was not that uncommon in those days. But I think that was also a factor in their childhood. And the only other thing I'd add is, you know, he had the usual outport 1940s, 1950s education in a one-room school for the most part. A variety of teachers, most of them untrained. Some of them, though, you know, brilliant teachers, but for the most part, untrained. So he got a lot of his education, I think, at home, and he got a lot of it through the medium of storytelling and the oral culture of Outport, Newfoundland at the time.
So in early adulthood, he decided he wanted to become a journalist, and he went to what was then called Ryerson. I'm guessing he was probably a brilliant student. Was he, in fact, a star student at Ryerson?
It's interesting because he was a star student at Ryerson, and he was a very ordinary student for 2 years at Memorial University, the old Memorial College he started at. I think actually it was a university at the time, but it was still on Parade Street. And he did that for 2 years, and he was a very mediocre student, and flunked a couple of courses in his second year. He thinks they were French and mathematics. And he gave it up. He went back to Arnold's Cove and worked for a year for his dad, who ran a little store there. And he said he got tired of plunging his arm down to his elbows in the salt beef barrel. And he read up and found out about this place in Toronto, then called the Ryerson Institute of Technology, where they taught the craft skills related to printing and publishing. And they were just beginning. They were only probably 5 or maybe a half a dozen years into their journalism program. And their journalism program not only taught basic journalism, you know, the 5 W's and inverted pyramid style and all this sort of thing, but it also was embedded in a program that was really the study of English literature. So it wasn't just journalism, it was journalism and a kind of mainstream liberal arts degree with a focus on English literature.
So he learned to write with some style, I guess.
He learned to write journalese, and he also discovered, because he worked for the Ryersonian, which was the school paper, that there was a certain license to go a little beyond, you know, ordinary news stories and write commentary and write editorials. And he started to flirt with satire, which suited him well because of his tremendous sense of humor and his generally wry look at everything he did and everywhere he went. But he also became popular there, and he became popular because the students were there because they had an interest in journalism and an interest in writing, and the second they read anything by Ray Guy, they realized this guy can write, you know, and that got him saluted at Ryerson in a way that he never was at Memorial.
You worked at the Telegram in the late 60s, early 70s. Now this whole era was a time when the paper was really journalistically, editorially very, very strong. It was a very good newspaper, wasn't it? Just talk about that period at the Telegram.
Well, you know, the Herder family owned the newspaper up until 1970. And the Herders, historically, going back for the 100 years, the century that they owned and ran it, or the 90 years, were strong newspaper people. And they always were interested in politics. They were always interested in Newfoundland culture. They were interested in the economy. They were basically on the case. you know, they ran an old-fashioned newspaper in older times. In the 1950s, post-Confederation, a number of things happened, and one of the things that happened is that the paper became better off. And the reason it did is that with Confederation came a fairly large dollop of national advertising. So car manufacturing companies, national companies, Woolworths, I don't know, I can't remember when Canadian Tire started, but that type of company suddenly saw a market in Newfoundland compatible with their Canadian advertising and promotional push, and the Telegram basically started to make a lot of money. Coincidentally, in the 1950s, there was still a large residue of anti-Confederation sentiment, particularly in St. John's, and particularly by business people, particularly upper-crust business people in St. John's, including the herders. They didn't like, you know, they were by disposition, perhaps they were anti-Confederate in the 1940s. They didn't like Smallwood. They didn't like the cut of his jib. And I'm overgeneralizing, of course, because there were exceptions. But that ethos pervaded the paper. Then along came an individual who had a significant impact on the paper and its disposition and its attitude towards politics, and that person was Harold Horwood. And Harold Horwood, in the Confederation years, was joined essentially, I think I say in the book, he was joined at the brain with Joey. They were really close friends. Joey Horwood and Great Power, the three Bolsheviks they were known as. Horwood, however, broke with Smallwood very, very early after Confederation. The first term he was an MLA, an MHA.
First MHA for Labrador.
For Labrador. And, but he broke with Smallwood, and when he did, he joined the Telegram, and he wrote a daily column, and he savaged the Smallwood government. And he did it in a fairly modern kind of investigative journalistic way. You know, he would read government documents, he would look at budgets in detail and so on. And he had the skills and the ability and the will to do the hard work. And his column had an extraordinary impact on government of the time. It paved the way in the 1950s for the person who came along in the 1960s, essentially as a kind of successor to Horwood, Ray Guy.
Yeah. I'm laughing because the irony is it was Joey Smallwood who convinced Harold Horwood to write that column.
Well, that's what Horwood has said, and he's written it in his own biographical books.
I guess Joey had the idea that, you know, because Harold and he had been friends and had fought the Confederation battle together, that he would be kind to his administration.
Well, you know, Joey had a lot of dimensions to him, and one of his dimensions, in fact, was a very keen interest in journalism.
Oh,
he didn't want journalists out there making him look silly or criticizing him, but he did like the idea. He was a journalist himself, as you know, for many, many years, including some years with the Telegram. So he was interested in that sort of thing. He may have been interested in having Horwood, you know, not sitting at the table with him, but I really don't know. They were friends. They became enemies. They subsequently became friends again. And late in their lives, in fact, they reestablished compatibility.
So, Ray, eventually he rises to the ranks of the columnists. He starts writing satire. How did that happen?
It was an evolution, essentially, from standard mainstream news reporting. And then there'd be an occasional dig or an occasional little turn of phrase that was different. And then by the time he was there, I would think no more than a year, you'd see a Ray Guy standard mainstream 5W's news story on page 1 of the paper or page 3 of the paper, particularly on the weekends. Inside, you might see a little commentary. And early in the game, it was fairly polite, even when in his references to Smallwood. They'd be more fun. They'd be more kind of you know, sending him up or taking the mickey out, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it didn't get fierce in the early years. It took several years for him to develop what really became his animosity towards Joe, and to write the sort of fierce columns that he wrote for, you know, 7 or 8 years of his time as a daily columnist in the Telegram, when Joey was, you know, not uncommonly the subject of the column 3 days a week.
I think some people might be surprised to learn that Ray was I mean, most people know him for his satire, but some people might be surprised to learn that he was a really solid news reporter. And one of the pieces in your book is one he wrote about a shooting in Whitburn. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it was a day of infamy in Whitburn, a small, inland Newfoundland town. You know where it is, and most people watching this, I think, will know. But it had an RCMP detachment, and a small one at the time. I think there were only 2 officers there. And 4 relatively low-temperature, low-life criminals were locked up at Her Majesty's Pen here in St. John's. They broke out. They broke out essentially by cutting their way through a wooden floor, and they escaped. And they'd been incarcerated at the Salmon Air Camp for some time before that, and they'd broken out of there a couple of times as well. But the 4 of them had been involved in similar crimes and sometimes the same crime. They broke out. They stole a vehicle, and they headed west. By the time they got to Whitburn, the RCMP had set up a roadblock, and it came to rest on the main street in Whitburn, which is, the center of a small town. And there was a showdown there, and eventually a shot fired that killed a young Mountie named Bob Amy, a young man from Nova Scotia, 24 years old, had been in that detachment for a relatively short time, maybe a year or 2. It's extremely well liked in the community. So in Newfoundland at the time, people would have heard about that on the radio the day it happened. But on the radio, it would be a fairly cursory report. 1964, Ray was only with the Telegram for a year and change at the time, and he was sent to Whitburn the next morning to get the story in great detail, which he did. And I think it was a singular achievement. The writing is, he wrote 2,500 words on the story.
And he really created the atmosphere.
He basically reproduced the atmosphere of the day before, which would have been the first opportunity for consumers of media in Newfoundland to really get the details of the story. And what he did, I think that was exemplary, and what he did with good journalistic practice as well. He listened hard. He talked to everybody in sight. He took extensive notes. He exhibited a sensitivity about it that most journalists don't. And he developed the drama as it had evolved the day before. He reproduced it, in fact, and it reads really a bit like a novel, to tell you the truth. But it was also very, very detailed, and it was rich in quotations from bystanders and witnesses, people who just saw this horrible event happen in front of their eyes, and also from people who knew that young Mountie, Bob Amy, and had great respect and regard for him. It was a huge story in the newspaper the next day. I think it occupied a page and change, and it was like a really, it was like a magazine article that somebody would spend a couple of months on. It was an amazing piece of journalism.
I suppose you could say it was an example of the new journalism. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but I'm thinking of people like Gay Talese and others,
Well, it had hints in that direction. It didn't go quite as far as a Gay Talese or a Tom Wolfe might go in a situation like that, but there were hints of Ray's own views. One of the things that he did was that he triggered a whole lot of questions about how this was allowed to happen. He posed them. He couldn't answer them that day. They'd be answered eventually with investigations and reports. In the court case itself, there was one of the young men obviously was charged and convicted and sentenced to hang. Hanging was still the punishment for capital murder at the time. And as you know, because I think you've read that piece of the book, that individual escaped really at the last minute. He was sentenced to be hanged 11 days after capital punishment was abolished in Canada.
Wow.
It was an extraordinary denouement to that story.
Yeah,
and in fact, that piece of the story, by the way, has been well told by Jack Fitzgerald in one of his books about great crimes in Newfoundland.
Right. Now, Ray wrote passionately, obviously, about lots of things, but there was one topic that was really in a category all to itself, and that was resettlement. Just talk about how worked up he could get about that topic.
Well, I mean, resettlement was a divisive public policy at the time and remains so for more than a decade. And in fact, there's still shadows of it around Newfoundland today and of its ability to divide people. Ray grew up in Arnold's Cove, and when Ray grew up in Arnold's Cove, it had about 200 people. By the time resettlement had played itself out, it had closer to 2,000. And all of these people moved from islands in Placentia Bay and resettled in Arnold's Cove. Arnold's Cove was designated as a growth area and a reception area, so people were channeled in there in the hundreds and at a pace that services could not keep up with. Ray essentially saw resettlement from the windows of his house in Arnold's Cove, and he absorbed the impact of it on the local community essentially from his parents and neighbors. Resettlement had an impact on both the people who were moving in and the people who were there, who lived in these communities forever. And many of the impacts were negative. Ray, in particular, observed and felt that resettlement was a bad thing, particularly for elderly people. Mm-hmm. He thought maybe young people could make their way and they're more resilient and more flexible and so on. But he saw a lot of situations, and he had some experience. He'd seen the Placentia Bay Islands. He knew what outport life was like. He observed a situation where people, in fact, were not better off in the growth communities, particularly older people, but were much worse off. He also felt, and lots, sociologists of some repute have supported this notion, that the program operated more with coercion than with voluntary activity. And all of this became he did most of his writing about resettlement in the late 1960s, 1968, 69, and so on. By then, he'd had a serious grievance with the Smallwood government that was playing out regularly in his columns. And he saw, Premier Smallwood at the time as essentially the architect of this initiative. He also saw the initiative as opportunistic because there was a bunch of federal money that went into resettlement. The resettlement program was really a series of programs, starting as provincial, then becoming provincial federal with still a fair amount of provincial money in it, and eventually mostly federal money, and a lot of it, in fact, Department of Fisheries money. Initiatives that Ray saw, and again, some evidence to support it, to wean people away from the inshore fishery and to look for onshore or growth center industrial work. Part of a larger kind of industrial development services program that the Smallwood government promoted. I think with goodwill, I think they saw, we have to do something about this. We can't deliver medical services and great schools and so on to thousands of communities. We've got to do something about it. And the other reality is that those communities were not always thriving, that's for sure. What they were, though, in general, were communities that were surviving, and when people had lived in them for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, the uprooting process was very, very, it was serious and damaging. And that's the way Guy interpreted it, that's the way he wrote about it. And some of his writing is incredibly acute and incredibly emotional on that subject. You're right, it was one of his big topics.
Ron, some would argue that Ray's best writing was done during the 60s and early 70s, and that after Smallwood left the scene, it lost its edge. Was that true, or was he just burnt out?
Well, I think I don't. Well, first of all, when you look back over his career, the irony is that his career as a columnist in the Evening Telegram, for which he was best known, and to this day remains perhaps best known among the people who know him at all, his writing was extraordinary, and it was great writing, but it wasn't necessarily the best of his career. That 10-year period was about 25 to 30% of Ray's career. He continued to write until literally 2013. He wrote right up to within a couple of months of his death in 2013. What happened after the telegram is that his writing was no longer contained in a sort of watertight compartment, the column on page 3 of the telegram. It was scattered all over journalisms and Hell's Half Acre, small publications, magazines, even company bulletins sometimes. But in the course of writing for the next 25, 30 or more years, he did work that in some ways I think was better than the telegram work. The telegram work, even though is wonderful, fun to read, highly satirical, a lot of it quite funny. It was narrow-focused. It had Smallwood as the nemesis, Smallwood as the devil incarnate, and a lot of his writing moved from just that position. After he left the telegram, particularly a few years after, when he married Kathy Hauser, a person you know well, I think you're friends, and had children, and had dogs and cats and a domestic life, his writing actually did change, and it was easiest to observe in columns that he wrote for Atlantic Insight magazine. He wrote for that magazine, which was Halifax-based, distributed widely in the Maritimes, less widely in Newfoundland. He wrote for it for a decade, and I think some of his best writing, more nuanced, broader, in a sense softer and kinder, but no less literate. In fact, if anything, more literary than in the past. So one of the objectives of the book, we talked about it earlier, is to try and exhibit some of that kind of writing. And then, of course, he had other outlets for his work, as you know, the CBC and the Sunday Express and so on.
Ron, you've done a brilliant job with the book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's great, and I hope that all the people out there buy it. It'd make a great Christmas present. Thank you again for being with us.
Well, Karl, thanks for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure.
And that's it for this edition of Karl Wells' Point to Point. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A